and I will introduce Emmanuel Alloa. Now, Emmanuel came here last year to talk with us about image as location, and he marked himself as a image philosopher, and he's also a publisher of many books, one of which I brought along just to wave it around here. Where is it? Here we go. He's the editor of Les Presses du Réel and of the Collection Perception edition, and we have a golden version here of Lev Manovich's Language of New Media in French. So that's a very compelling edition. And do you want to get started right away? Should we do some introductions? Yeah. So he's joining us from France, Paris, France, and he's a professor of philosophy at the University of St. Gallen, Switzerland. St. Gallen is famous for being the home of the very first library, I think, in Europe. Is that true? Yeah. They're very proud of their library.
One of the nicest.
One of the nicest and oldest libraries in Europe. And he's about to spend 2-year sabbatical to write a new book, so we're very excited about that. Help me welcome Emmanuel Alloa.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me, and I would like to give a very special thanks to the entire team that made this conference possible. I'm thinking of Lara, I'm thinking of Sabine, Jale, Stéphane, Philippe, and all the others. This is really fantastic, and I'm starting to believe that what I was told about California is actually true, and I'm saying this to my European colleagues who might be here for the first time. Beware of the conversations you're having, because it might turn out that 1 year later your ideas materialize into a conference. I'll start right away with my topic of today, the Code of Transparency. In 1913, the Italian poet Aldo Palazzeschi, who was one of the leading figures of the artistic movement known as Futurism, wrote a small poem titled La Casina di Cristallo, the Little Crystal House. And it reads the following: I dream of a little crystal house, a house every common mortal could possess, which would have nothing in particular, but which would be all transparent, made of crystal. You would see me eating, you would see me while I sleep. Uncover my dreams, you would see me defecating, you would see me changing my shirt. For the artistic and political avant-gardes of the early 20th century, transparency yielded the promise of a different society which would overcome the traditional hierarchies and social divisions. Walter Benjamin, arguably one of the most important thinkers about media, old and new, expressed this idea in the following blunt terms: to live in a glass house is a revolutionary virtue par excellence. And he added that it involves a moral exhibitionism we badly need. Discretion concerning one's own existence, once an aristocratic virtue, has become more and more an affair of petits bourgeois parvenus. What still seemed a provocative idea in 1929, belonging to the radical avant-gardes, which had to rebuke the rest of society, has definitely lost its taste of scandal today. Disclosing one's intimate life and inner thoughts has nothing revolutionary anymore. Rather, it has become an inescapable necessity in an age which is increasingly taking the form of an age of confession. The contemporary age has taken the very notion of confession a step further, disentangling it from any religious dimension. And what in Augustine's Confessions, the subject publicly displayed himself by articulating in front of God the content of his soul. Since Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, the role of the divine is now taken over by society. This is what Rousseau says: in the enterprise, I've made myself entirely to the I've made myself to show entirely to the public. Nothing of me must remain obscure or hidden for it. It must incessantly maintain myself under their eyes. I would like to be able, in some fashion, to make my soul transparent in the eyes of the reader, and for that reason I strive to show it to her from every point of view, to cast light upon it through the everyday, so that no movement takes place within it that she does not perceive, in order for her to be able to judge herself, the principle producing them. Of course. So, yet, if it is as if individual transparency were not enough, and that transparency had to be extended to society as such. In parallel to the rise of self-transparency as one of the key features of modern subjectivity, transparency is modernity's code for the promise of an unhindered permeability of persons, goods, and ideas. Far of being restricted to individuals, transparency has to embrace all aspects of society in order to fulfill its ambitions. So while the word is actually a very old one, it actually reaches back to Aristotle, it has only recently become a centerpiece in public discourse. Indeed, these last years have seen transparency becoming a highly fashionable catchword, and demands for more transparency have been voiced in domains as diverse as corporate and public administration, financial transactions, scientific research, sport contests, technology, or media. Just going to show you a diagram here from New York Times, which shows the occurrence, the use of the word transparency from 1990 until 2009. And every line is a month of time, every slice. And you see the tremendous increase of this frequency of the word transparency, the exponential increase of its use. And the figures for the last years would probably only yet confirm this tendency. At the same time, the ubiquitous presence of the word is inversely proportional to its conceptual clarity. Used permanently as if its meaning were obvious and shared by everybody, the concept of transparency has rarely been addressed in its own right. What is indisputably a fact is that transparency is credited with having a remarkably vast range of positive effects. It is said to increase the responsiveness of governments, improve accountability of individuals, allow for greater compliance, promote participatory practices, and even to prevent conflicts from emerging. Initially associated with the struggles of a civil society for more openness at the level of top-end governance, think of the WikiLeaks motto, privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. As by now, it largely infuses the discourses of most public and private organizations. And even before the WikiLeaks scandals and the revelations by Edward Snowden, US President Barack Obama made the increase of transparency a linchpin of his presidency with the introduction of initiatives such as the OJI, Open Government Initiative, and the bolstering of the Freedom of Information Act, while many Western governments and parties are now increasingly integrating similar policies into their agendas. An analogous tendency can be observed on a corporate level. While this started in the technology sector with Google publicizing its first transparency report, as already mentioned by Anupam in 2010, an increasing number of companies are now releasing annual reports based on audits measuring the degree of corporate transparency. The same phenomenon has taken place on a level, a non-governmental level, and intergovernmental organizations level, where minor industry of transparency initiatives has flourished. Whether non-governmental organizations such as Transparency International, which has been monitoring corruption in international development since 1993, intergovernmental initiatives such as the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, launched at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002, or the many initiatives on a corporate level, such as the Transparency Initiative launched by the American Association for Public Opinion Research in 2014, an increase in transparency is seen as a general remedy for many problems. I'm not even going to start about the European examples I could mention here. Just for the US context, you might be familiar with the Sunlight Foundation's aim to make government more accountable and transparent through the use of, I quote, cutting-edge technologies and ideas, while other prominent internet projects that fall under the banner of the transparency movement include OpenSecrets.org, which charts the relationship between financial interests and public policies, and MAPLight.org, a database showing the connections between campaign donations and legislative votes. However, the demand for more transparency is in no way restricted to political, institutional, and corporate entities. Statistical studies show that transparency is today, alongside with authenticity and competence, the most used notion by CEOs in their annual addresses. And this suggests that the line between corporate and personal identities has become blurry, since CEOs are meant to incorporate the corporation, just as politicians are held to be representative of the body politic. As it were, the ideal of transparency promotes a request for behavioral coherence, which applies indistinctly to persons and to organizations alike. Not content with exposing previously latent practices, the very idea of transparency is to take out the barriers that could allow for future concealed operations and to make the actors publicly accountable for the entirety of their actions. I'm just going to mention here a very famous ethicist, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who holds that transparency and its correlate, the possibility of unrestrained inspection, represents, I quote, the perfection of democracy, the device that allows us to know what our governments are really doing, that keeps tabs on corporate abuses, and that protects our individual freedoms, just as it subjects our personal lives to public scrutiny. So here again, we have some kind of non-coercive contrition, and these transparency regimes, so the advocates assert, allow for a transferal of control from repression to self-control, which according to many studies is all the more effective. The example Singer was referring to is a study, a survey of the variations of spontaneous generosity depending on whether one feels watched or not. And this is a team by Melissa Bateson at the University of Newcastle. They monitored how much users of a university coffee room would leave as a donation in an honesty box on an average, and how their behavior would be modified by adding a sticker with praying eyes above the box instead of just flowers. As it turned out, people would be significantly more generous when they would see these praying eyes, the reminder of the behavior potentially being watched. A general consensus aired by President Obama stresses this repeatedly, that transparency promotes accountability, not only at the level of the administration but also beyond, at the level of individual moral life. A virtuous individual, as it were, is an individual who has nothing to hide. And as a result, one could say that the more transparent than thou has become the secular equivalent of the holier than thou. To summarize, the evidence gathered suggests that transparency is not only a concept that's generally considered neutral and non-partisan, hence its availability for all sorts of claim and demands, but it is also seen as unconditionally positive. One would be hard-pressed to find advocates struggling for an overall increase in opacity. Not for nothing has transparency risen to the status of a kind of post-ideological norm in contemporary moral discourses, although, as the German philosopher Byung-Chul Han stated, transparency could equally be seen as an ideology which, like all ideologies, has a positive core that has been mystified and made absolute. Like a window pane whose glare decreases the more translucent it becomes, the notion of transparency signals a native non-reflectiveness, claiming for itself that there is nothing to be seen. The perfectly transparent window is a window which completely diverts the attention from itself. The less we see the window pane, the more we see through it. But if seeing through is synonymous with overlooking, one can easily understand why transparency as an operative concept rarely became an object of theoretical reflection in its own right. If the concept of transparency proves to have a consistency of its own, then the parallel inquiry into both the demand for organizational transparency and the imperative of self-transparency could lead to a new understanding how to recapture the problem of social existence. For today, I'd like to share the following hypothesis with you. What does it mean to think of transparency as a code? If I'm now referring to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, a code can mean different things. One of the meanings of the code is it is a set of letters, numbers, symbols, etc. used to send secretly a message to someone. Now, if we take this meaning of the code, the principle of transparency is, of course, totally anti-code. On the contrary, we see the transparency's advocates fighting encryption, stealth surveillance, and other types of non-reciprocal data exchange. By hacking the code, transparency fights secrecy and promotes a code-free society. But what about the other meanings of transparency here? The two other meanings would be that the code is a set of laws or regulations or a set of ideas or rules about how to behave. Is the new imperative of transparency really as code-free as it pretends? Or could it be that it represents itself a new kind of law and regulation that, while organizing procedures of critique, is itself immune to critique? And what about transparency as a code of conduct that must remain unquestioned? But I would like to suggest that transparency increasingly comes close to the paradox of a codeless code. While some still see the demand for more transparency as a part of an endeavor of demystifying the arcanas of power and meaning policies, others think that even deciphering is still wrong, as an ultimate transparency would mean a perfectly codeless, literal self-transparency where the thing coincides with its own meaning. On the backdrop of anti-interpretationism and the momentum, what is now known as the new realism, it would be worthwhile investigating the obsession with transparency that is expressed here as a kind of dream of accessing things and beings directly. And this decoding attitude, this anti-decoding attitude, was already to be found in some of the otherwise so luminous pages of Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation, which anticipated so many later developments. So what Susan Sontag says here is that we have to stop deciphering culture. We have to stop deciphering art. Once upon a time, say for Dante, it must have been a revolutionary and creative move to design works of art so that it might be experienced on several levels. Now it is not. It reinforces the principle of redundancy that is the principal affliction of modern life. Once upon a time when high art was scarce, it must have been a revolutionary and creative move to interpret works of art. Now it is not. Transparency is the highest, most liberating value in art and in criticism today, she writes in 1966. Transparency means experiencing the luminousness of the thing in itself, of things being what they are. I think she perfectly captures this obsession with reaching out to the thing itself, reaching out to the being itself, freed of any layer of interpretation, freed of any layer of code, kind of immediate givenness of the thing itself, perfect realism. Now, I think the hypothesis of this conference is to say that transparency is not immediacy, and that transparency has to be manufactured. Transparency presents itself as being all the more efficient when it is hiding or turning its own manufacturing invisible. Real transparency, as it were, is naturalized transparency. And this would be a wonderful follow-up for this conference if we were continuing discussing issues of naturalization, how to turn something that is actually manufactured, that is created, that is produced into something that goes without saying, that has become totally naturalized, kind of second nature. In the third part of my talk here, I would like to do what I had announced and indicate the move from surveillance to self-discipline. In recent years, surveillance studies have become a major field of academic research with a vast number of publications on data, panopticism, hypervisibility, and the like. And in this context, Jeremy Bentham's model prison of the panopticon constitutes a particularly evident step in the transformation of surveillance into self-surveillance. As Michel Foucault showed in his analysis of the circular prison architecture, I'm quoting here from Foucault, there is no need for arms, physical violence, material constraints, just a gaze, an inspecting gaze, a gaze which every individual under its weight will end by interiorizing to the point that he is his own overseer each individual thus exercising this surveillance over and against himself. A superb formula, power exercised continuously and for what turns out to be a minimal cost. I think the success of Michel Foucault's Bentham reading has been detrimental to a finer understanding of all the implications of Bentham's thinking of modernity and for modernity. Indeed, in Discipline and Punish, Foucault sees Bentham's panopticon as a dispositive of penitentiary coercion, which could be then extended, as Foucault says, to other domains of society, so the organization of warehouses, schools, hospitals, and so on. But as a matter of fact, Bentham had thought that his model could apply in other contexts, but not in order to extend the prison model, but rather because he thought the prison to be but one among many education institutions, or institutions of production in general, such as this panopticon house of industry. So the ultimate goal is not to develop a new theory of absolute power, as some Foucault readers have wrongly assumed, but to bring out a kind of self-managing society. A different reading of Bentham is necessary, which would allow to reconnect Bentham's panopticon project with the rest of his utilitarian thinking. While Foucault makes no mention of the other Bentham writings, Bentham's scholarship was inversely leaving out all the too bulky panopticon writings. As a matter of fact, if you have a look at the critical edition of Bentham works, there's no trace of the panopticon. So it's so strange. On the Foucault scholarship, everybody focuses on the panopticon, and Bentham scholars don't know what to do with these panopticon writings. An interesting go-between is the Slovenian philosopher Miran Božović, and he has not only done a beautiful job of editing those panopticon writings and letters, but he has also shown that we need another reading of this dispositive of the panopticon. Foucault himself had stated that his analysis of Bentham's panopticon was only an exemplar analysis for a disciplinary regime, which, as he thought, stopped being relevant in the 20th century. Simply extending the model to the contemporary situation, as many authors in surveillance studies tend to do, is thus not being just with Foucault. It is not sufficient either, as authors like Toni Negri and Michael Hart assert, that we have left the panoptic disciplinary regime and now live in a regime of control which is allegedly more flexible. It is Bentham himself who has introduced the idea of transparency in his writing. It's a very crucial notion in his writing. I don't have time to delve on this. And on the other hand, he's introduced the idea of flexibility under the notion of uncertainty. So he's a theorist of transparency on the one hand side, and on the other side, as Božović has shown, he is actually a theorist of opacity, as a kind of structural necessity of opacity as a kind of uncertainty. So Bentham, as the theorist of total transparency, as we often tend to read him, actually needs opacity, because it is only the opacity that allows for the gaze to become a self-referential gaze. I don't know if someone is watching me. There's an opaqueness of the surveillance itself, which is necessary for self-transparency. So surveillance has to become potential surveillance. I cannot know if there is someone in this tower watching me. The tower itself has to become opaque in order to bring about transparency. So Bentham, who is a total utilitarian, who has this idea that everything has to be laid out and to be made efficient, becomes a theorist of fiction. He says, I don't know. There might be someone in this tower who is godlike. There might be someone who is like God. There might be God. God might actually not even exist. The warden might not even exist. But all of this doesn't matter, because I have to behave as if there was a warden, as if there was God. Ideal perfection, if that were the object, would require that each person should actually be in that predicament during every instance of time. This being impossible, the next thing to be wished for is that at every instant, seeing reason to believe as much is not being able to satisfy himself to the contrary. He should himself conceive to be so. Conceive. This is where fiction comes into play. This amazing passages where Bentham as a utilitarian theorist who says we have to reduce the costs needs fiction, and I think this is beautiful. In a strategic instrumentalization of uncertainty, which itself rests on the ultimate unverifiability of surveillance, fiction plays a major role. It is only through the help of fiction that transparency can realistically be implemented. And on this very point, there is a strong continuity between Bentham's position and current policies of transparency. The process as such remains just as unverifiable as before, but the fiction of a homogeneous, flawless procedure produces a new kind of systemic trust. And moreover, the new capacities of data tracking extend, of course, beyond what Bentham could think of, that is kind of synchronic transparency. Data tracking allows for something like diachronical tracking, the archival capacities for data stocking making this possible, the permanent threat of belated disclosure. Someone finds out kind of data that pops up, resurfaces from the deep internet. So this possibility of being watched extends not only in space but also in time, and induces a self-surveillance which leads to self-restraint. For quite some time, the demand for public confessions isn't anymore reserved to the class of political leaders of public figures. It concerns every single individual. Social networks require permanent self-expression, sharing and commenting, which immediately show that it is possible to have some kind of participatory, self-reflective democracies. But also confessional practices induced by the automatized tracking systems reveal the detail of social life in ever finer, infinitesimal details. So 2 centuries ago, this is what Bentham devised, and this was the circle set up in many prisons around the world. This is one prison, the Parramatta prison from Australia. Just giving you an example, maybe closer to the experiences from the Bay Area. That's the novel by award-winning author Dave Eggers, The Circle. It's another kind of circle. It is virtual architectures that are outlined as kind of dystopical novel of our time. As some said, this is the novel, this is the 1984 Orwellian novel of our time, Dave Eggers' The Circle. So for those of you who haven't read this wonderful and terrifying book, Dave Eggers describes a dystopic future not very far from now. And as the novel unfolds, we follow the progressive descent of the main protagonist, May, into the nested structure of the circle, and we, as the readers, identify with May, but at the same time, we are those who fatally watch her. We are both the victims and the villains in the story, and since May does not post enough messages on the social media network and doesn't confess enough of her feelings, she works for this huge corporation called The Circle, she eventually will be sanctioned. Participation rank is among the lowest. One of the 3 wise men running The Circle, Eamon Bailey, will first force her to go transparent, as it is called. Going transparent, and behind her the 3 almost Orwellian principles appear on the screen. Secrets are lies, caring is sharing, privacy is theft. Individual cameras called sea change and one on the body will from now on modify May's behavior. Of course, one could say she could have known better. Isn't the point about transparency that it is supposed to substitute surveillance with self-discipline? And I'll close with this quote by former CEO, Google CEO Eric Schmidt, who had already warned us some time ago, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to say a few things about him. And while that happens, maybe we have a quick question for Emmanuel. One question I had for Emmanuel was this. So if transparency produces a very clean behavior in everybody, doesn't that mean that we're not revealing anything anymore because there's nothing left to reveal, and therefore, in a way, transparency has defeated itself, right? Because there's no sinister corners to be looked at anymore, and so there's a desert, sort of a moral desert that results, because nobody has to make any decisions about it. There's nothing to discuss anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it would be the end of deliberation in a way, because of course everything seems crystal clear. Although I would be tempted to say that transparency is never enough. So it also fuels conspiracy theories. That's the wonderful flip side. So it's never transparent enough. There are always things that are hidden. And from a media theoretical standpoint, this is very interesting, I think, that it actually always produces some kind of darkness. And so the fight against opacity is never over. So I don't think this is a situation we will ever reach. So I don't know. Maybe this is the good news.
Yeah, but it's strange that the opacity would be the good part, right? So that's interesting how we have to hold on to these things.